Let's look at the game Karpov versus Yusupov from 1997 in the Dortmund tournament. So Karpov was white. He opened with d4, and the players eventually transposed into a Queen's Gambit declined. In the Queen's Gambit declined, one of the troubles black has is getting his c8 bishop into play. It's known as the bad bishop because it's behind his central pawn chain right now. So let's keep that in mind as the game progresses. Okay, play went knight c3, bishop e7, bishop g5, h6, bishop h4, castles, e3, and then knight e4. And this introduces us to the Lasker defense in the Queen's Gambit declined. I made a previous video analyzing this defense in detail. I'll put a link in the description if you want to take a look at that video to fully grasp the moves that were just played. Okay, but then the players went down the main line. They traded bishops, and then rook c1, c6. Now bishop d3 hits the knight on e4 for a second time, so it's going to trade itself. And now in this position, black needs a plan for how to deal with his problem bishop. So it's behind this chain of pawns here. So to get it out, to break it into the game, black has to play one of two freeing moves. He either has to play e5 and then develop the bishop along that diagonal, or he has to play c5 and then fianchetto the bishop to b7. Okay, either way he does it, note that pushing one of these pawns forward unguards d5 a little bit, makes d5 a bit weaker. And white can attack that and perhaps even saddle black with an isolated queen's pawn. So because of that, black would rather not nurse a weakness on d5. He prefers to just give up d5. Okay, trades the pawns. This looks a little radical at first because the whole reason black wanted a strong pawn on d5 was to control e4 to stop white from expanding in the center. So why does he give up control of the center like this? Well, early on in the opening, the plan was to control e4 and stop white from getting the pawn duo in the center. But this is the middle game. Things have changed, and the main thing that's changed is some pieces have been traded, a pair of minor pieces. So because those pieces have been traded, a strong pawn duo in the center is not as effective as it would be against a full complement of pieces. If black had pieces all over the board, then a strong center is more effective. It can threaten to, for example, push forward and kick pieces out of the way. But once things start to get traded, the importance of the center lessens. So black gives up that pawn so he doesn't have a weakness to nurse on d5, and he's planning on making a break afterwards. Let's see how he does it. Okay, he plays knight d7, which could support either one of these pawn breaks. Then white castles, and black decides to play b6 to fianchetto his bishop. And his plan is to also play c5 to open up this diagonal. Okay, so black is on the verge of achieving equality in this position. So if white wants to maintain a small opening advantage, he has to be very precise here and do something quickly. And Karpov makes an excellent move. Bishop d3. Very subtle move. Notice that unleashes the rook to hit the c6 pawn. But more than that, white's aim in moving the bishop was to redeploy it to e4. And from e4 it will also be hitting the c6 pawn, and it will be exerting pressure down this diagonal pointed at the rook in the corner. So black has to react correctly here. For example, it would be a mistake to continue with your fianchetto plan, bishop to b7, because white would play bishop to e4, putting pressure on that pawn. And the pawn is pinned now. It can't move forward without losing the bishop. So black would be forced to defend the pawn again with a move like rook f to c8. But then white would have queen to c2, piling more pressure up on that pawn. And white could even follow up with the other rook to c1 and triple up on the c file. And the pawn would be lost. Okay. So black has to play more precisely than bishop b7. The correct move that black played in this position was c5. Okay, remove that weakness from c6 right away. Play c5. Okay, and Karpov responded bishop to e4 as intended, hitting the rook in the corner. Black moved it aside. It's interesting to note another possibility in this position is bishop to a6 counterattacking a rook. So both rooks are hanging now. But white would come out with a slightly better position after trading rooks and then playing bishop to c6, hitting the knight. So here, black has a couple of things he might try. He might try retreating the bishop, or he might try retreating the knight and using it to attack this bishop. But knight to b8 doesn't really work. It actually loses a pawn. Let's see how white wins a pawn. He plays queen takes f1, knight takes c6. He trades pawns on c5 and then plays queen to b5, forking the knight and the pawn. And that pawn on c5 is hit twice. So black is going to lose that pawn. Okay, so backing up, besides playing knight to b8, black's only other move is bishop to a6, but that runs into the powerful queen to a4, which is a fork. We're attacking the bishop, and we have a battery on that knight. Okay. So perhaps black would play knight to b8 to remove his knight from being captured and to protect his bishop. But then again, white can trade pawns on c5, whether black decides to trade a pair of minor pieces now or recapture. He will have an isolated pawn on c5. He doesn't immediately lose a pawn this time, but that isolated pawn becomes a weakness that white can attack. So white has a slight edge in this position. So going back to the game, after Karpov played bishop e4, black slid the rook aside, and now white plays a move that perplexes me a bit. Queen to a4. Okay, queen to a4 does hit the pawn on a7, but in a moment we're going to see the queen retreat back to c2, so I wonder why it doesn't go to c2 immediately. Okay, with the queen on a4, black has to do something about his a7 pawn, and he addresses it by playing bishop to b7, offering a trade of bishops here. And then white took, and black recaptured, so his rook is now defending his pawn. Let's take stock of the position for a minute here. Who did that trade of bishops really benefit? Okay, well, the first instinct I have is black, because that was black's problem bishop in the opening. And that was white's good bishop in the opening because his central pawns are on the opposite colored squares. So black successfully dealt with his problem bishop and got it out. In fact, traded it off, okay, instead of having it stuck behind a wall of pawns. But on the other hand, that bishop was actually no longer a bad bishop in this position. If you take a look at this position, black solved the problem of his dark squared bishop by pushing the pawns to b6 and c5 and getting this clear diagonal. He no longer has a pawn on d5 blocking it. So this is not a bad bishop anymore. It's a perfectly good bishop, just like white's bishop is good. So black's really trading a good bishop for a good bishop here. But black is getting the worst end of this deal, because in trading off his light squared bishop, he's left behind some holes in his position that he can't guard. Look at these light squared weaknesses on the queen side. Okay, he has no bishop to help protect those weaknesses. White can take advantage of those weaknesses and play against them with both his knight and his queen. Okay, so white, in playing queen to a4 in that position, induced black to trade bishops here, and white claims a small advantage. But I don't think black had to trade bishops. I was looking at some other possible moves to address the pawn on a7. For example, black might have tried knight to f6, guarding the pawn with his queen, and also hitting the bishop simultaneously. Okay, that looks like a good move to me, so I don't know why black didn't do that. Another possible move is to push the pawn forward, and it's actually better on a5 than it is on a6. We'll see in a moment that black likes to control the b4 square. Okay, so he could have pushed it forward. It's going to go forward to a5 in a few moves anyway. Okay, and he could have kept his bishop to guard his light squares. Okay, he still would have to develop his bishop somewhere, so it's not so easy. But that was another possibility. So anyway, after queen to a4, white induced the trade of bishops, and then white drops his queen back to c2. Now, why does he put his queen back on c2? Well, several reasons, actually. It's a multi-purpose move. One purpose is just to create a nice battery down the c file. So white has control of this c file. This pawn on c5 is probably going to disappear soon. These pawns are going to trade. So white will have control of this open c file. But there's other reasons for this move. Another reason is black in this position would like to push his pawn to e5 to attack d4, maybe trade it, and white could recapture with his pawn and trade, recapture with his knight. So there would be two open files. If there are two open files, then having control of the c file isn't as big of a deal as it is if it's the only open file. Okay, so e5 is a plan of black, but the queen that went back to c2 prevents the move e5 because white could play queen to e4. And that pins the pawn. The queen behind it would be lost if that pawn moved. And not only does it pin the pawn, but it also hits this rook on b7. So black is doing worse in that position. So it's a multi-purpose move. Okay. All right, so black needs a plan here because he's got two things going against him. He's got these light square weaknesses over here on the queen side, and he also has this c file pressure to deal with. Specifically, he has to do something to blunt white's activity down the c file. And there's a few ways to do that. He could, for example, try to push the b pawn to b5 and the c pawn to c4 and block up the file that way. Another idea is to prepare for this move e5. He can't play it now as we saw, but he could try to prepare for it. Yet another way to deal with the c file pressure is to play c takes d4, and white would recapture with his knight because he doesn't want an isolated pawn on the d file. And then black can stick his knight on c5 and block that c file. But the knight really won't last long there because white would have the move b4 to kick it away. But that explains black's next move. Black moves a5. It's not just a random move. When somebody like me plays chess and you see me make a move like a5, that's probably just some random move. It's because I can't think of a plan. Okay, but that move is intended to stop b4 once a knight lands here. So it's controlling b4. So now black really is threatening to trade pawns here on d4 and then stick his knight in on c5 to block that c file, which is why white now plays a3. to further control b4. So now it's not such a good idea to do this. It doesn't work because white would have b4, and he'd still have a pawn there to kick that knight back. Okay. So after a3, black changes plans here. He puts his rook on e8. And again, if this were me playing the black pieces, that would just be some, random move like, oh, I don't know, my rook wasn't doing anything on the f file, let's move it over to a central file. But that rook on e8 has a purpose. It's guarding the queen. Remember what we talked about before? Black wants to push this pawn, but he would run into the move queen to e4, and the pawn would be pinned on e5. Well, it no longer would be pinned because the rook is guarding the queen. Every move here has a strategic purpose. Okay, white decides to maybe get some play along the d file since black is maybe playing against the c file. So white's going to transfer his rooks over to the d file here. Okay, black makes a funny looking move. He moves his rook back. Well, at least now the rooks are connected. But again, we have the problem of the move queen to e4, which would hit that rook on b7 if black decides to go through with this plan of e5. So he's removing his rook there. So black's last two moves, rook from f to e8 and rook on the b file to b8, all seem to indicate that he wants to play e5. Okay. But does he do it? Well, let's see. White takes time to gain a little lift so he doesn't have any back rank mates. Okay, I don't see any back rank mates, but what do I know? I'm sure I'm not looking into this game as deeply as the players themselves were, but I suspect that's what the move is for. And then black transfers his rook to the d file to oppose white's rook here in the d file. So he doesn't push e5. Okay. The plans here seem very fluid to me. We're not sure if we're going to play down the c file or the d file. We're not sure if we're going to push e5. Things keep changing from move to move. Things are very fluid, at least from my point of view. So white transfers his other rook over to the d file, maybe intending to play d takes c5 and then gain control over that d file. But then black transfers his rook back to a new file, the c file. So that rook went from b8 to d8 back to c8. Probably because white just moved the rook over and opened up his queen, which is now vulnerable to attack by c takes d4. Which is probably why white plays d5. So now the c file is not going to be the open file like we discussed earlier. Looks like the d file is going to become open. And what do you know? Karpov's rooks are on the d file. Okay, so e takes d5, rook takes d5, and now knight to f6 hits the rook. So the rook doesn't retreat back down the d file. Karpov has in mind an endgame at this point. Okay, and we'll talk about why that endgame is going to be favorable to him, even with this equal material on the board. But Karpov plays for an endgame. He plays rook e5 hitting the queen, and Yusupov slides the queen to c7. Okay, and they trade rooks, and then Karpov fixes the queenside structure here with the single pawn on a4. Okay, neither the a nor the b pawn can move forward now. By the way, in the game, in the analysis that Yusupov gave in the game, he said, I shouldn't have put my queen on c7. A more active way to defend would have been to put it on b7. Okay, see how hard chess is? If I were playing this game, I'm like, okay, b7, c7, I don't know, I'm getting my queen out of the way. Okay, here's why b7 is more active. It's because after the trade of rooks, Okay. And then Karpov's intended move, he would probably play a4 to fix that queenside structure. Then the queen is on b7 now instead of c7, which gives black this active move, putting the queen in the center. Okay, and if the queens get traded, then the black rook becomes active along this rank. Okay. So I think the queen is sitting better there in the center than it is on c7. All right, anyway, Yusupov played queen c7, rooks got traded, and then a4 to fix the queen side. And it's in this position that Karpov said in his analysis of the game that he has a clear advantage in this game. Okay, I don't really see it until I hear the explanation or I think it through for a long time. Again, if this is just a couple amateurs playing, then anybody could win this. But Karpov has a clear advantage, and the reason is he says he's basically playing with an extra pawn. These two pawns are nullifying these three pawns. Black can't get a passed pawn over here so easily. He can't mobilize his majority on the queen side. But the majority that Karpov has on the king side is very healthy. So he's basically playing 4 to 3 here. 4 pawns to 3. He's up a pawn. So it's because of this structure over here that Karpov decided to go into an endgame. Anyway, play continued rook d8 to oppose that rook. Rooks got traded. And then knight e5. Why knight e5? Well, look at that weak pawn over there. White's got to get to that pawn. So he'd like to post his knight on c4. That would be a nice, strong, permanent outpost for the knight. Probably play b3 to solidify it there. And the knight can exert constant pressure on b6, and black would have to keep guarding it. Okay, queen d5. I suppose centralizing the queen here, getting it off of the back rank. But also, after knight c4, black has knight to d7 to guard that, and now his queen isn't behind his knight, his queen is in front of his knight. Okay, so now this knight has to nurse this pawn on b6. Okay, so b3 to solidify the knight on c4, and now both players are going to start playing on the king side, getting their kings active. Karpov's going to want to start pushing his majority safely. Black plays f5. Okay, maybe blunting this action of the queen. I don't know. So the kings start to move. Okay, Karpov plays f3, maybe planning e4 in the future. King e7, king e2, queen e6, putting that in line with the king. Queen c3, looks like he's hitting this pawn on g7. And I'm not going to analyze this endgame in any great detail. I was more interested in the strategy of the middle game. But let's continue. Black blocks that threat with his knight. King f2, king d7, so black's transferring his knight over, or his king rather, over to guard b6, so his queen doesn't have to do it forever. Okay, g4. Now that's an interesting move. I stopped and paused here. White's threatening something here. So white's threatening g takes f5, queen takes f5, knight takes b6 check, so winning a pawn. So black has to do something about that. And I don't think he reacts correctly. He plays king to c6 to guard his pawn, so this would no longer win that pawn. Okay, but then white has this nice move, queen to e5, forking the queen and the pawn, and you're going to see in a minute how white goes up a pawn. So I think a better response to g4 was to just take it. Okay, and keep your queen right there, guarding that. But white would still be doing really well in this position again, still playing 3, and he has a passed pawn already, still playing 3 to 2 pawns over here on the king side. Okay, but black played king c6, and I think that allows white to win a pawn after forking And this forces the trade of queens, check. So he calls check after the trade of queens. And that means if the king goes out of check somewhere, that's kind of a silly move, then white gets a pawn. Like I said, he wins a pawn. Unless he gets out of check by threatening the knight. But if he gets out of check by threatening the knight, like he did in the game, then knight to c4 comes, and now white's threatening two pawns. He's going to win one of them. Okay. Black decides to take on g4, but white wins this pawn with check. King to c6. White escapes the threat while attacking another pawn. So quite a long sequence of pawn attacks. Black takes a pawn. I don't think it's much better to take on the h-file. White would have things under control. But he takes this f-pawn. White takes back. Pawns are even, but I said white was going to go up a pawn. He is, because black can't defend a5. It's a long sequence there that Karpov must have calculated very accurately and Yusupov didn't. Or maybe Yusupov went for this line on purpose, thinking it his best chance to draw. So long line, and white goes up a pawn. Okay, now king d5 takes the pawn. Black couldn't stop that. g5. He's going to try to get some counterplay over here with his queenside pawns. Okay, some maneuvering. Pushes his pawn forward. Knight to e8. I don't know, maybe he's transferring it here or here, trying to stop this pawn. He has to get his knight over to stop that a pawn at some point. King e3, knight c7, knight c4 check, king e6, king f2. I don't think there's any difference between king f2 and king f3. He's headed towards this square. Knight a6, he's trying to stop this a pawn. King g3, so the king and pawn will deal with that pawn duo. Knight b4. You still have to play this endgame accurately as white. You still have to win it. You're just one pawn up here. h4. Knight c6, stopping the pawn. Well, not stopping it, I suppose. The knight's got that square covered. Okay. a5. Knight b4, now he's stopping the pawn. It can't go to a6. By the way, earlier I don't think it benefits black to do this and let the white king come in. This knight can handle this pawn just fine if it tries to run for a queen. So black holds his position and stops the white king from entering. Okay, knight b4, knight d2, attacking the pawn. Maybe you should have just stayed there on b4, just letting the pawn advance. Okay, white or black trades pawns here. And now the black king runs for this a pawn. This knight can't stay there forever. So the black king is going to run to address that a pawn. He's giving up this pawn, and he hopes this knight can stop this pawn. Okay, but let's see how the race turns out. So black gets the pawn, but this king is positioned perfectly to escort his pawn home. So e6, king b5, he's running over here, but he doesn't have time. After e7, black resigns. Okay, you have to think about why he resigned here. What happens if black takes the pawn? It's the only chance. It's going to queen otherwise. Let's see. White would take the knight. Black would have to come forward and threaten the pawn. Knight would drop back to protect it. And now the only productive thing the black king can do is attack the knight. It looks like maybe he's going to draw, because if the knight moves away, he gets the pawn. And white doesn't have mating material. But no, white has just enough tempi in this position to win. After king c3, white has king to d6 attacking this pawn. And if the black king takes the knight, then we get this pawn, and we're just in time to queen this one. So that's why black resigned. All right, I hope you enjoyed this rich strategic game as much as I did. Thanks for watching.